What's up guys, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm bringing to you another episode of On the Shelf. This is a show where I like to experiment with my own collection in the hopes to give you some ideas for your own displays. So if that sounds cool with you, stick around because today I'm bringing to you my Hot Toys Avengers Endgame display to complete my entire shelf all the way along behind me here, from Infinity War to Endgame. But before we get started, do us a favor would ya? Hit that like button, notification bell, and subscribe to the channel. Now let's get to it. Okay guys, contained to one shelf, right next to the Infinity War shelf I have my current Endgame display, featuring 10 figures representing one of my favourite films of all time. Now whilst I love both Infinity War and Endgame, I chose not to go too deep into the line as I normally only collect my favourite characters, and these two lines were huge. However, by dedicating some space to display figures from the two films, it did allow me to pick up some characters I may not have otherwise have picked up. So for this shelf, I'm going for a movie poster type of look with a mix of action and stoicism, much like the Infinity War display. I did go back and forth on how I would set it up, at first thinking I was going to have them all fighting Thanos, but after some trial and error I decided to break it up into 4 sections, this way I could capture some moments and team ups that I had on my mind. Now let's zoom in and take a closer look. Kicking off the shelf we have Hawkeye and Black Widow first. I always knew I was going to pose these two together, so then it became how would I accomplish that? Well, this setup here is inspired by Yongbum on Instagram, shout out to a master poser. When I saw one of his displays for Hawkeye and Black Widow with her running toward the edge of the cliff and him attempting to shoot an arrow to prevent her from jumping so he could, I knew I wanted to recreate that moment. Looking at Natasha first, once I saw this pose I knew this was the pose that she will most likely always stay in for me, and to be fair, I can't think of a better way to display and remember her character. To have her running so heroically to sacrifice herself to give the Avengers a chance to bring everyone back, so epic and poetic. The pose itself is pretty dynamic and stressful to parts of the suit, I'm sure, but I'm comfortable with that. As mentioned, I don't see myself changing her pose for the foreseeable future, but do be aware yourself if you are looking to pose your figures like this long term, that can be an issue. To assist with the scene I'm going for here, I decided to use the rock base that came with the battle damaged Thanos figure as well, and I'm using the clear pole and crotch grabber to help her balance as I only have her left foot here touching the base. Now let's talk about Hawkeye. I'm really impressed by this figure. 2 different looks you can have, so many accessories and a decent head sculpt, plus he moves really well. For this pose I have him set up a bit differently from how Yongbum did in his scene, and a big reason for that is I don't have an extra base and the current setup and space here on the shelf. I need to get a base that I can have him up on to recreate it more accurately, but for now, to keep having levels in the display I had to put him up in the air so he could be easier to view along with Nat. So I have him jumping up and aiming about to shoot an arrow to knock her back instead. I think having him in this moment with Nat is a great way to display him and creates a scene that takes me right back to that heart-wrenching moment in Endgame when they fought to see who would make the sacrifice. Moving on to Rocket and Rhodey, aka Iron Patriot. Together in a moment to remind me of them teaming up in that final battle against Thanos and his army. I'm a fan of both of these characters and it made sense to me to get these versions of them from Endgame. Rocket's overall journey in the MCU is fantastic and I've always been a fan of Rhodey. I'm super excited to see where his story goes in Armor Wars. Looking at Rhodey first, you may be thinking this is an unconventional pose for him, and I agree, it really is. However, something about it I love, and this angle and the presence I feel it has in this position, all weapons out bracing and allowing Rocket to take aim before he opens up and starts blasting himself, I think is pretty cool. The suit is crazy, beefy and so intricate, not to mention the amazing Don Cheadle head sculpt that comes with it too. I'm definitely planning to kit bash a Rhodey to go with the Tony. Yes, so much weight, yet surprisingly very poseable with good balance. He's holding Rocket on his own, no problem like this. Now to the raccoon himself, Rocket. Such a fun piece to have. I knew I wanted him in the collection somehow, as I loved his journey in the MCU. The way his story evolved from Guardians 1 all the way to Guardians 3 was amazing, and he became a much more prominent character than I ever anticipated him to become. Pairing him with Rhodey is a fun way to represent that moment of them teaming up and kicking ass. The figure itself surprised me for the size it is too. He articulates really well and has a good amount of accessories. The only thing I would have preferred is if he had two head sculpts so you could have a relaxed facial expression too, but beggars can't be choosers. All in all, very happy to have him in the collection. Moving on to Rescue, this is the same pose I've had her in for ages, and originally I was going to change it up to something else, but when I was arranging this display, it made sense to have her in this pose, in this spot still, as I wanted her next to Tony in the high space behind him. Eventually I'll change her up, but I do still love this look, especially with the backpack accessory. It just feels like a waste not to use it. The figure has great articulation. It's so well engineered so you can hit a lot of really great poses with her. She has a great paint job, and to top it off, the Pepper Potts face sculpt is also spot on. All in all, it's a fantastic piece. I love her role and relationship with Tony throughout the films, so I'm grateful to have a representation of her in the collection. Okay, zooming in on Tony in the iconic snap pose. What else is there to say? Such an iconic moment. I've had this guy in this pose since I got him. It's so iconic in fact that I picked up 2 copies so I could always have this version displayed in some variation of a snap pose, whilst also being able to create other poses to display this suit in. For this video, I did retweak the pose to freshen the look up. Very slight changes can make a big difference on how the figure looks, so I'll give you a breakdown on what I did this time around. I started by opening up the hips more and pulling them forward. Then I extended up the top of the torso and twisted it to the left, and dropped the left side down, which accentuates the look of the right side being higher. And then to finish it off, I tried to angle him as if he's looking at us from the shelf as he's about to snap. Moving on to Battle Damaged Thanos. One of my favourite villains ever, and still one of my favourite figures in the collection to this day. He comes with an angry expression head sculpt too, but honestly, I love this head sculpt so much that the other sits in storage not being used, unfortunately. I think this look of him defeated is spectacular, and whilst it's specific, you do have a lot of options when posing him looking defeated. You can have him standing like this, I used to have him leaning forward reaching, and I've seen people have him sitting with this head sculpt. Personally, I think it works perfectly to create a scene along with Tony in the front snapping. It takes me back to the moment and reminds me of just how awesome it was to see Marvel pull off what they did with the Infinity Saga. Looking at the God of Thunder now, standing with Stormbreaker. Here's the beginning of the big 3 together to cap off the shelf. I know this version of Thor doesn't get much love, but for me, I love this guy. His journey was rough to Endgame, and I think Chris Hemsworth managed to convey the sadness he felt after everything he had gone through really well, all while still being very humorous. I think this is a unique piece to have and allows me to have the big 3 together like they were in Endgame right before the big battle. The figure itself has more mobility issues, but not as bad as I think was made out. I did manage to achieve some pretty cool poses with him in my Thor posing showcase if you're interested in checking that out after this. Lastly, I got him a wired cape from Lucky at Unreal Toys, who you can find on Instagram. Such strong wires, it's a great cape to have. Now onto my other battle damaged Mark 85. For this pose, I wanted him hovering in the air with the backpack accessory on. For me, having him in the middle and up higher again fills the space in the display and also creates a nice visual with Thor and Cap on either side. For the pose, I wanted to experiment with having him in the air slightly on an angle leaning forward quite a bit. Normally for a pose like this, you'd use the repulsor hands to indicate he's using his thrusters, but by switching it out to fists, it changes the tone and intention I feel. One thing to be aware of on a pose like this too is I have the waist grabber up higher under his arms around the thicker piece of the upper body to hold him. As he is leaning forward quite a bit, it creates more risk of him slipping out or falling forward, so be sure to bend the pole and adjust the balance as best you can when trying a pose like this. Lastly, to cap off the shelf, we have Endgame Captain America, the definitive Captain America by Hot Toys I feel. Another figure so good, I had to have two of him. I think he and Tony both got to have very satisfying ends to their journeys in Endgame, with Steve getting to have his life with the woman he loves being a great one. Now I've played around with different variations of this pose for a while now, sometimes making him face more forward and look up at us, but this time I've changed his stance and I have him looking more side on to us when viewing the shelf from front on. This version of Cap has lots of posing options and quite a few accessories, but again it's a simple pose like this that takes me back to that moment when he catches Mjolnir before saying Avengers Assemble, and that I wish to keep him in for now. And that's it, guys and girls, my current Endgame display. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of On the Shelf and maybe got some inspiration for your own displays. I thank you all for tuning in, and if you haven't already done so, do us a favor, would ya? Hit that like button, notification bell, and subscribe to the channel. Memberships are also available now, so if you'd like to support a little bit more, take a look and see if you'd like to join the Iron Legion. Lastly, we got reviews and unboxings, story theme posing showcases, display tips and tricks, plus live streams including the rundown where we deep dive into film and TV. But for now, guys, until next time, I'm out.